The generator died with a final wheeze. Hurricane Harvey had plunged StreamTech's Austin headquarters into darkness, leaving CEO Cassandra Blake facing her worst nightmare, a $50 million deal slipping away in 2 hours. Emergency lighting cast harsh shadows across 15 anxious faces in the conference room. "Call a real technician," Marcus sneered, his eyes falling on the maintenance worker crouched beside the silent machine. The man wore faded coveralls, calloused hands already exploring the generator's innards with surgical precision. Something about his quiet confidence made Cassandra's pulse quicken. Her desperation transformed into reckless audacity as she stepped forward, designer heels clicking against concrete. "You think you can fix this?" she challenged, her voice carrying across the room like a dare. The maintenance man looked up, meeting her gaze with startling directness. Cassandra felt heat rise to her cheeks as the words tumbled out. "Fix the generator. I'll kiss you right now." The room held its breath. But who exactly was this mysterious man in work clothes, and why did her outrageous promise feel less like desperation and more like destiny? 6 hours earlier, Lucas Miller sat in the back seat of his father's battered pickup truck, rubbing sleep from 8-year-old eyes. Daniel Miller checked his toolbox one final time, the metal latches clicking in the pre-dawn silence. The Austin sky hung heavy with approaching storm clouds, promising the kind of weather that kept most people indoors, but sent maintenance workers scrambling. "Daddy has to leave early today, buddy. Mrs. Rodriguez will take you to school." Lucas nodded, accustomed to these early morning partings that had become routine since his mother's death 3 years prior. Daniel worked as a freelance repair technician, fixing everything from broken air conditioners to industrial generators for small companies across the city. The work paid enough to keep them afloat in their tiny apartment, though barely. "I'll be home by 6 to make dinner, okay?" The promise hung between them like a prayer Daniel wasn't sure he could keep. Lucas clutched his worn teddy bear, the last gift from his mother Sarah, and watched his father's reflection in the rearview mirror. Dark circles shadowed Daniel's eyes, testament to too many late nights and early mornings spent keeping other people's worlds running while their own remained perpetually on the edge of falling apart. The truck's engine coughed to life, joining the symphony of a neighborhood waking up to face another day of small struggles and quiet hopes. Daniel's throat tightened as he drove away, leaving his son with the neighbor while he ventured out to fix other people's problems, always hoping he wouldn't break his own family in the process. The call had come at 3 in the afternoon from StreamTech's facilities manager. Generator problems, urgent repair needed, double overtime pay. Daniel had hesitated, calculating the time against his promise to Lucas, but the money would cover next month's rent with enough left over for new school clothes. He'd arrived at the gleaming downtown building feeling out of place among the glass and steel monuments to success. The security guard barely glanced at his work orders, waving him toward the service elevator with practiced indifference. StreamTech occupied 3 floors of premium office space, all exposed brick and polished concrete, the kind of aesthetic that screamed success to anyone who entered. Daniel found the generator room in the basement, a utilitarian space that contrasted sharply with the designer workspace above. The machine hummed contentedly, showing no signs of the reported problems, but he began his routine inspection anyway. The hurricane warning came over the radio at 8 p.m., just as Daniel was packing up his tools. The generator had needed only minor adjustments, a loose connection here, a cleaned filter there. Standard maintenance that any competent technician could handle, though the facilities manager had insisted on calling it an emergency to justify the overtime expense. Daniel should have left then, should have driven home to Lucas and Mrs. Rodriguez's worried questions about the approaching storm. Instead, something made him linger in the basement, double-checking his work with the thoroughness that had earned him a reputation for reliability in a city full of fly-by-night repair services. The building's lights flickered once, twice, then died completely as Hurricane Harvey announced its arrival with characteristic Texas drama. Emergency power kicked in immediately, but Daniel knew from experience that backup systems were fragile things, prone to failure when you needed them most. The sound of hurried footsteps echoed down the stairwell as StreamTech's leadership descended into what had suddenly become the most important room in the building. The CEO arrived first, a woman in her mid-30s with sharp eyes and the kind of controlled composure that came from making life-changing decisions on a daily basis. She took in the scene with quick efficiency, the dead generator, the emergency lighting casting everything in harsh relief, and Daniel standing quietly in the corner like a piece of equipment himself. Her team filed in behind her, all nervous energy and worried whispers about contracts and deadlines and the financial implications of extended power outages. The air thick with expensive cologne and anxiety sweat, a combination that spoke to the peculiar pressures of white-collar crisis management. Marcus Fleming, the marketing director, stepped forward with the kind of aggressive confidence that masked deeper insecurities. His suit cost more than Daniel made in a month, a fact that both men recognized without discussion. "Ma'am, we need to call a professional service. Someone with actual credentials." His eyes swept over Daniel's work clothes with barely concealed disdain, the automatic dismissal of someone who had never done physical work, but understood its place in the social hierarchy. The other team members murmured agreement, their faith placed in certifications and company letterheads rather than the man who had spent the last 5 hours ensuring their building's systems ran smoothly. Daniel said nothing, accustomed to being invisible until the moment his skills became indispensable. He had learned long ago that competence spoke louder than credentials, though the lesson often came at the cost of bruised pride and swallowed words. Cassandra Blake studied the silent generator with the intensity of someone calculating the exact cost of failure. $50 million hung in the balance, a contract that would secure StreamTech's expansion into renewable energy markets and validate 3 years of careful positioning against larger competitors. The irony wasn't lost on her that the deal hinged on a machine designed to provide backup power, much like the company itself had been built on the premise of being there when other solutions failed. "How long do we have?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. 2 hours until the client presentation, 2 hours to prove that StreamTech could deliver on its promises even when the infrastructure around them crumbled. The weight of leadership pressed down on her shoulders, familiar and unwelcome, as 15 pairs of eyes looked to her for solutions she didn't have. Daniel's hands moved over the generator with practiced familiarity, reading its condition through touch and sound in ways that diagnostic equipment couldn't match. 3 decades of mechanical work had taught him to listen to machines, to understand their particular languages of vibration and heat, and the subtle changes in their breathing. This generator was old but well-maintained, the kind of industrial workhorse that could run for years if treated properly. The storm had likely caused a power surge that triggered the automatic shutdown, a safety feature rather than a malfunction, though explaining that to a room full of panicked executives would require more words than Daniel typically used in a day. He caught Cassandra's eye and nodded once, a gesture that conveyed more confidence than any verbose explanation could provide. The simple movement shifted something in the room's dynamics, drawing attention to the man who had been invisible moments before. "Can you actually fix it?" Cassandra's question carried the weight of desperation wrapped in executive authority. She stepped closer, her presence commanding attention even in work clothes and emergency lighting. There was something different about her approach, a directness that cut through the corporate politeness her team maintained even in crisis. Daniel met her gaze without the deference most people expected when addressing a CEO, recognizing in her eyes the same kind of focused intensity he brought to complex repairs. "Yes." The single word hung in the air between them, unadorned by qualifications or hedges, the kind of straightforward answer that corporate meetings rarely produced. The certainty in his voice surprised everyone, including himself, though years of similar emergencies had taught him to trust his instincts about machines, even when he doubted everything else. Marcus's laugh carried no humor, just the brittle edge of someone watching his carefully constructed world threatening to collapse. Right. And I suppose next you'll tell us you went to MIT. The comment drew nervous chuckles from the team, a release valve for tension that needed somewhere to go. Daniel's expression didn't change, though something flickered behind his eyes. A flash of history that suggested Marcus's casual dismissal had struck closer to truth than intended. But that story belonged to a different life, one that had ended in a hospital room 3 years ago when Sarah drew her last breath and left him to rebuild everything from scratch. The man who had once designed systems for aerospace companies had died with his wife, leaving behind only the father who needed to provide for his son through whatever means available. Cassandra felt something shift inside her chest as she watched Daniel's hands move with surgical precision over the generator's components. There was an artistry to his movements that spoke to deep knowledge and hard-earned expertise, the kind of competence that couldn't be faked or bought. Her business instincts, honed by years of evaluating people and their capabilities, told her this man could deliver what he promised. But something else stirred as well, a recognition that went beyond professional assessment to something more personal and infinitely more dangerous. The thought came unbidden. When was the last time anyone in her life had given her a simple, confident answer without hedging or political calculation? "If you can fix this thing," she heard herself saying, the words emerging from some reckless part of her psyche that had been dormant too long. "I'll kiss you right here, right now." The silence that followed was absolute, the kind of quiet that occurs when everyone in a room simultaneously realizes they've witnessed something they weren't meant to see. 15 faces turned toward her with expressions ranging from shock to amusement to barely concealed horror at their CEO's professional suicide. Marcus's mouth fell open, his carefully cultivated image of corporate respectability crumbling in real time. But Daniel simply nodded and reached for his toolbox, as if beautiful women made outrageous promises to him every day and he had work to do, regardless of the surrounding drama. The casualness of his response somehow made Cassandra's declaration even more shocking, transforming what might have been dismissed as executive stress into something that felt dangerously like a real commitment. 20 minutes later, the generator coughed to life with a rumble that seemed to shake the entire building. Emergency lighting gave way to full illumination as systems throughout StreamTech came back online, computers booting up and climate control resuming its quiet hum. The team erupted in cheers and applause, relief flooding the room like a physical presence. But Cassandra barely noticed their celebration, her attention fixed entirely on the man who had just saved her company, with nothing more than competence and quiet confidence. Daniel began packing his tools with the same methodical care he had shown throughout the repair, seemingly unaware that he had become the center of a drama that had nothing to do with generators and everything to do with the promise hanging between them like an unexploded bomb. She approached him slowly, aware that every eye in the room tracked her movement. Her team had stopped celebrating, sensing that something significant was about to happen that would reshape their understanding of their CEO and possibly their own positions within the company hierarchy. Daniel looked up as she drew near, his expression unreadable but not unwelcoming, as if he was curious to see how she would handle the situation she had created. Up close, she could see the exhaustion lines around his eyes, the calluses on his hands, the small scars that spoke to a life of physical work and real consequences. When she leaned forward and kissed his cheek, a brief, soft contact that somehow contained more intimacy than most relationships achieved, she caught the scent of honest sweat and machine oil, so different from the designer cologne that usually surrounded her. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the generator's steady rumble. Daniel's eyes searched her face as if trying to solve a puzzle more complex than any machine he had ever repaired. For a moment that stretched longer than either expected, they remained close enough to feel each other's breath. Two people from completely different worlds discovering that proximity could create its own kind of electricity. Then he stepped back, shouldering his toolbox with practiced ease, and the spell broke like a soap bubble touched by reality. "I should go," he said, the first unnecessary words he had spoken all evening. Cassandra wanted to ask him to stay, to explain himself, to tell her something that would make sense of the strange connection she felt. Instead, she watched him walk away, leaving her standing in front of her team with the taste of possibility on her lips and absolutely no idea what came next. The following week passed in a blur of successful presentations and signed contracts. StreamTech's renewable energy division officially launched with the kind of fanfare that made industry headlines. But Cassandra found herself distracted during meetings, her mind wandering to memories of competent hands and quiet confidence. She told herself it was simple gratitude, that anyone would feel indebted to the person who had saved their company from disaster. But when the air conditioning in her office began making strange noises, she found herself picking up the phone to call the building's facilities manager with a specific request. "I need the same technician who fixed our generator last week. Daniel Miller, I think his name was." The lie came easily, as did the justification that followed. StreamTech needed reliable service providers, and proven competence deserved repeat business. When Daniel arrived the next morning, he carried himself with the same quiet efficiency that had impressed her during the crisis, but something had changed in the way he looked at her. The invisible barrier between management and service provider had been breached, leaving them in uncertain territory that neither had experience navigating. "Miss Blake," he said, setting down his toolbox with careful precision. "Your assistant said you were having air conditioning problems." The formality in his voice felt forced, as if he was trying to rebuild walls that had already been demolished. Cassandra gestured toward her office, acutely aware that she was wearing a black dress that hugged her curves in ways her usual business suits did not. The choice had been unconscious, she told herself, simply reaching for the first thing in her closet that morning. "What exactly seems to be the problem?" he asked, examining the wall-mounted unit with the same focused attention he had given the generator. Cassandra found herself studying his profile, noting the way concentration deepened the lines around his eyes and the unconscious competence with which his hands moved over the machine's housing. "It's been making noise," she said, though truthfully the air conditioner sounded no different than usual. "Grinding sounds, like something's loose inside." The fabrication felt dangerous and necessary, a small lie that created space for something larger to develop. Daniel nodded and began his inspection, removing the unit's cover to reveal the complex machinery within. His movements had the grace of long practice, each action purposeful and economical, so different from the wasteful gestures of men who had never learned that time was a limited resource with real consequences for misuse. "I don't see anything obviously wrong," Daniel said after 20 minutes of thorough examination. "The bearings are fine. The mounting is secure. Maybe what you're hearing is normal operation noise amplified by the building's acoustics." He began reassembling the unit with the same care he had shown in taking it apart, but his explanation felt incomplete somehow, as if he understood that mechanical problems weren't the real reason for his presence. Cassandra moved closer, ostensibly to observe his work, but really to test the boundaries of whatever was developing between them. "You don't think I'm making it up, do you?" The question carried more weight than a simple inquiry about air conditioning repair, and they both knew it. Daniel's hands stilled for a moment before continuing their work, the pause confirming that he was navigating the same uncertain terrain. "I think," he said carefully, That successful people don't usually lie about broken air conditioners. The observation was delivered without judgment, merely a statement of fact that acknowledged the strangeness of their situation without condemning it. Cassandra felt heat rise in her cheeks, caught in her deception, but somehow not embarrassed by it. Instead, she felt a reckless urge to push further into territory that promised either connection or disaster with equal probability. "What if I told you I called you here because I wanted to see you again?" The admission hung between them like a challenge, daring him to respond with similar honesty or retreat into the safety of professional distance. Daniel finished tightening the last screw before turning to face her directly, his expression serious but not unkind. "Then I'd say you're playing a game you don't understand with someone who can't afford to lose." His voice carried no anger, only a quiet certainty that stopped her short. For the first time since the generator incident, Cassandra realized she knew nothing about this man beyond his competence with machinery and his unsettling ability to remain calm under pressure. The expensive clothes and prestigious address that defined her world meant nothing to him, but his dismissal didn't feel like reverse snobbery so much as protective pragmatism. "Why can't you afford to lose?" she asked, genuinely curious about what stakes she might be playing with unknowingly. Daniel packed his tools with deliberate slowness, as if considering how much truth the moment could bear. When he looked at her again, something had shifted in his expression, a decision made that would change the nature of everything that followed. "Because I have an 8-year-old son who's already lost his mother, and I won't let him get attached to someone who'll disappear when reality sets in." The words hit Cassandra like a physical blow, revealing depths of responsibility and pain she hadn't considered. This wasn't about her curiosity or his competence. It was about a child who had already learned that people you love can vanish without warning, leaving behind only the echoes of promises that couldn't be kept. The weight of that knowledge settled on her shoulders like a heavy coat, transforming her interest from simple attraction into something more complex and demanding. She had been thinking in terms of adult games and sophisticated emotions, but Daniel lived in a world where every decision carried consequences for someone who depended on him completely. "I wouldn't disappear," she said, though even as the words left her lips, she wondered if they were true. Her track record with relationships was poor, a series of connections that had withered under the demands of her career and her inability to prioritize emotional intimacy over professional success. But something about Daniel's quiet strength made her want to be better than her history suggested, to find out if she could be the kind of person who stayed when staying became difficult. "You say that now," he replied, shouldering his toolbox with finality. "But you don't know what you're saying it to. You see a man who fixed your generator, but you don't see the single father who works 3 jobs to keep his son in a decent school district, or the widower who still wakes up some mornings expecting to find his wife in the kitchen making coffee." He moved toward the door, then stopped as if something had occurred to him. "My wife's name was Sarah. She died of cancer 3 years ago, after a 2-year fight that bankrupted us financially and emotionally. I had to sell our house to pay medical bills, and now Lucas and I live in a 2-bedroom apartment where the walls are thin and the neighbors are loud, and sometimes there's not enough money for both groceries and the electric bill." Each revelation felt like a test, as if he was deliberately building barriers to see if she would climb over them or use them as an excuse to retreat. Cassandra absorbed the information without flinching, understanding that he was showing her the cost of admission to his world. The question was whether she had the courage to pay it, or whether her attraction would wilt when confronted with the messiness of real life and genuine need. 2 weeks of silence followed, during which Cassandra threw herself into work with renewed intensity, trying to forget the way Daniel's hands had moved with such confidence and care. But late at night, when the office grew quiet and she was alone with her thoughts, she found herself wondering about the kind of man who could rebuild a life from grief and loss without becoming bitter or broken. The few relationships in her past had been with men who shared her background and ambitions, partnerships built on mutual advantage rather than genuine need or complementary strength. None of them had challenged her to be better or different, only more successful in ways that felt increasingly meaningless. Daniel represented something she had never encountered. A man who didn't want anything from her except honesty, and who offered something she hadn't known she needed: the chance to matter to someone in ways that had nothing to do with her professional accomplishments. The call came on a Friday afternoon while she was reviewing quarterly reports, her assistant's voice carrying an unusual note of urgency. "Ms. Blake, there's a situation at Lincoln Elementary. They're asking about emergency contacts for Lucas Miller." Cassandra's stomach dropped as she recognized the name, her mind racing through possibilities, none of which ended well. She had no official connection to Lucas, no legal standing that would justify her involvement, but somehow she found herself in her car, driving toward the school without conscious decision. The elementary building looked like every other institutional structure designed to contain children's energy while channeling their minds toward productive purposes, but today it felt ominous in the way that familiar places could when touched by crisis. The principal, Mrs. Henderson, met her in the office with the kind of carefully neutral expression that educators perfected for dealing with family complications they couldn't fully understand. "Ms. Blake, I'm not sure why you're here, but Lucas asked us to call you when we couldn't reach his father. There was an incident during recess. Nothing serious, but we need someone to pick him up." The explanation was delivered with professional courtesy that couldn't quite mask curiosity about why a CEO would serve as emergency contact for a maintenance worker's child. Cassandra followed the principal down a hallway lined with children's artwork and motivational posters, her heels clicking against linoleum that had been polished to institutional perfection. She found Lucas sitting in a small office, his school clothes dirty, and his face streaked with the evidence of recent tears. "Ms. Blake." Lucas looked up with surprise that quickly transformed into relief, as if her presence solved problems he hadn't known how to articulate. "They called you?" The question carried weight beyond its simple words, confirmation that she had achieved some status in his mind that went beyond casual acquaintance. Cassandra knelt beside his chair, bringing herself to his eye level in a gesture that felt both natural and significant. "Your dad couldn't be reached, so the school called his emergency contacts. Apparently I'm on the list." The explanation was technically accurate, though she had no memory of being added to any school forms. Lucas nodded as if this made perfect sense, his 8-year-old logic accepting that important adults in his life would naturally be available when needed. "What happened, sweetheart?" The endearment emerged without conscious thought, feeling appropriate in ways that surprised her. Lucas wiped his nose with the back of his hand, a gesture so purely childlike that it made Cassandra's chest tight with protective emotion she hadn't known she possessed. "Tommy Henderson said I don't have a real family because it's just me and Dad. He said families need mums and dads, not just one person who has to work all the time." The explanation revealed layers of hurt that went beyond playground cruelty to touch on fundamental questions of belonging and legitimacy that no child should have to navigate alone. Cassandra felt anger rise in her throat, not just at the thoughtless boy who had caused pain, but at a world that measured family worth by traditional structures rather than love and commitment. "What did you do when he said that?" she asked, though the dirt on his clothes and the principal's earlier comment about an incident suggested she already knew the answer. Lucas looked down at his hands, clearly struggling between honesty and the knowledge that his actions had been inappropriate. "I pushed him. Really hard. He fell down and scraped his knee and started crying. and then Mrs. Patterson came over and said I was in big trouble. The admission was delivered with the kind of remorse that suggested genuine understanding of wrongdoing rather than simple regret at being caught. Cassandra recognized the impossible position Lucas occupied, too young to articulate complex emotions about loss and family structure, but old enough to understand that his situation made him vulnerable to casual cruelty from peers who had never questioned their own security. The drive to Daniel's workplace took 20 minutes through Austin traffic that seemed determined to delay their arrival, giving Cassandra time to absorb the magnitude of what had just occurred. She had gone from curious observer to active participant in this family's daily struggles, crossing boundaries that couldn't be easily uncrossed. Lucas sat quietly in the passenger seat, occasionally glancing at her with expressions that suggested he was still processing her presence in his crisis. "Are you going to tell Dad I got in trouble?" The question revealed his greatest concern, not the school's discipline or his classmates' opinion, but his father's disappointment in behavior that fell short of the standards they had established together. The trust implicit in his worry touched something deep in Cassandra's chest, a recognition that she had somehow become someone whose opinion mattered to this serious 8-year-old. "I'm going to tell him what happened and let him decide how to handle it," she said, choosing honesty over false reassurance. "But Lucas, I want you to know that what Tommy said was wrong. Families come in all different shapes and sizes, and yours is just as real and important as anyone else's." The words felt inadequate for addressing wounds that went deeper than playground politics. But Lucas nodded with the gravity of someone who needed to hear that his life had value despite its differences from traditional expectations. They found Daniel at a construction site in South Austin, his work clothes covered in the dust and grime of a job that required physical presence in a way that Cassandra's corporate responsibilities never did. His expression cycled through confusion, concern, and something that might have been gratitude when he saw them approaching together. "There was an incident at school," Cassandra explained before Lucas could launch into his own version of events. "He's not hurt, and it's nothing that can't be resolved, but the school needed someone to pick him up." Her summary was designed to provide essential information without creating additional panic, a skill she had learned in corporate crisis management that proved equally useful in family emergencies. Daniel's attention shifted between his son and the woman who had somehow become involved in their personal drama, his expression revealing the complex emotions of someone who was grateful for help but uncomfortable with dependence. Lucas moved to stand beside his father, with the automatic seeking of comfort that spoke to their bond, but his eyes remained on Cassandra, as if to confirm that her presence was real rather than imagined. The conversation that followed took place in Daniel's truck while Lucas dozed in the back seat, exhausted by the emotional intensity of his day. Daniel listened without interruption as Cassandra provided details about the playground incident and Lucas's response, his face growing tighter as he absorbed the implications of his son's vulnerability to social judgment. "I should have prepared him better," he said finally, the self-recrimination evident in every syllable. "I knew this would happen eventually, kids asking questions about why he doesn't have a mother, making comments about our family not being normal. I just hoped we'd have more time before he had to face it." The pain in his voice revealed depths of parental anxiety that went beyond immediate discipline to encompass broader concerns about raising a child in circumstances that deviated from expectations. "You can't protect him from everything," Cassandra said gently, recognizing in Daniel's worry the same impossible burden she had watched her own mother carry years earlier. "Kids can be cruel without meaning to be, and Lucas is going to face questions about his family no matter how well you prepare him. But he's also going to learn that he has people who love him and support him, and that's more important than fitting into traditional categories." Her response was designed to offer perspective rather than advice, understanding that Daniel's parenting decisions were his to make, while providing the reassurance that he was already doing better than his fears suggested. The intimacy of the conversation felt both natural and significant, a recognition that they were discussing the welfare of a child who mattered to both of them in ways that went beyond casual concern. 3 months had passed since the generator incident, transforming their lives in ways none of them could have predicted. Sunday morning found them at the cemetery where Sarah was buried, a monthly ritual that had evolved to include Cassandra's presence without awkwardness or intrusion. Lucas knelt beside the gravestone, arranging fresh daisies with the careful attention of someone who understood that small gestures carried large meanings. "Mom," he began in the matter-of-fact tone he had developed for these conversations, "I won first place in the science fair with my renewable energy project. Cassandra helped me understand the business side, and Dad taught me how the machines work. We made a really good team." The inclusion of Cassandra in his report felt natural rather than forced, evidence that she had earned genuine place in their family narrative. Standing nearby, Cassandra felt the weight of belonging in ways she had never experienced before. Her penthouse apartment had become a place she slept rather than lived, her real home existing wherever Daniel and Lucas were. The transformation hadn't been seamless or simple, requiring constant negotiation of boundaries and expectations as they learned to function as something more than friendship, but not quite traditional family. But the difficulties had been matched by rewards she hadn't known existed. The simple pleasure of making pancakes on Sunday mornings, the satisfaction of helping with homework that challenged her business degree in unexpected ways, the profound contentment of being needed for reasons that had nothing to do with professional competence. "Your mom would be proud of you," Daniel said, his hand settling on Lucas's shoulder with the automatic gesture of someone who had learned that comfort was often delivered through touch rather than words. She always believed that taking care of the planet was one of the most important jobs adults could do for children. The reference to Sarah was delivered without the sharp edge of pain that had characterized earlier mentions, suggesting that grief was evolving into something more manageable, if not less profound. Cassandra watched the exchange with the mixture of inclusion and respect that she had learned to navigate, understanding that Sarah's memory enhanced rather than threatened what they were building together. The drive home was filled with Lucas's chatter about summer plans that naturally included all 3 of them, his assumptions about their continued togetherness reflecting the security that consistent presence had provided. Cassandra found herself included in decisions about camp enrollment and vacation destinations, with the casual acceptance that spoke to genuine integration rather than polite accommodation. The responsibility felt both natural and significant, a recognition that her choices now affected not just her own future, but the welfare of people who had become essential to her definition of happiness and success. The weight of that responsibility was matched by its rewards, the daily proof that love expressed through action created bonds stronger than any formal commitment could provide. Back at the apartment, they settled into the lazy Sunday routine that had evolved over months of shared weekends. Daniel reading the paper while Cassandra and Lucas worked on a jigsaw puzzle that had been in progress for weeks. The scene was domestic in ways that would have felt foreign to Cassandra's former life, but now seemed like the most natural thing in the world. Success, she had learned, wasn't just about professional achievement or financial security. It was about creating spaces where people could be themselves completely, where love was expressed through presence and attention rather than grand gestures or expensive gifts. These ordinary moments contained more genuine intimacy than her previous relationships had achieved through romantic gestures or elaborate experiences. "Cassandra," Lucas said, looking up from the puzzle piece he was trying to fit into place. "Are you going to stay with us forever?" The question was delivered with characteristic directness, innocent curiosity rather than loaded expectation. Daniel's newspaper rustled as he lowered it to observe the conversation, his expression carefully neutral, but his attention complete. The question hung in the air between them, not demanding immediate answer, but requiring honesty about intentions and feelings that they had been developing gradually rather than declaring dramatically. Forever was a word that carried risks none of them were entirely prepared to face. But it was also a word that had begun to feel less like promise and more like simple truth. "I'm going to stay as long as you and your dad want me here," Cassandra replied, choosing present commitment over future guarantees. "Because this," she gestured around the small apartment that had become more home than any space she had ever owned, "this is where I want to be." The declaration was simple and complete, encompassing everything she had learned about love and priority and the difference between what she had thought she wanted and what she actually needed. Daniel's response was wordless, a smile that carried the weight of understanding and acceptance, confirmation that they were building something worth keeping. Lucas returned to his puzzle with satisfied efficiency, as if her answer had resolved questions he hadn't known how to ask. Outside their windows, Austin continued its restless urban rhythm, but inside their small apartment, time moved differently, measured not in deadlines or obligations, but in shared breaths and quiet laughter and the simple miracle of people choosing each other every day. They had built something beautiful from the raw materials of loss and hope and the kind of daily commitment that proved love was an action rather than just a feeling. The future stretched ahead of them, uncertain but no longer frightening, because they had learned that the most important promises weren't about forever, but about today. And today they were together. And today was enough.